The foreign ministers of Quad members met in Australia today as China and Russia are now growing increasingly close ahead of a potential invasion of Ukraine. In a thinly veiled swipe at China's growing economic and military expansion, the United States, Australia, Japan and India pledged to deepen cooperation to ensure that the Indo-Pacific region was free from coercion. Despite being outside the group's scope, the escalating crisis between the West and Russia over Ukraine was a top focus. The U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken cast Moscow's build-up as a challenge to the international rules-based order, which the Quad would work to preserve, he said.
Diplomacy and dialogue. We would strongly prefer to resolve the differences that we have through diplomacy, through dialogue. That is the responsible way to do things. We've made every possible effort to engage Russia, to look at the concerns that it's raised, to share concerns that we have, that European partners and allies have, to see if we can't find ways to advance collective security on a reciprocal basis. But at the same time, we've been very clear in building deterrence and building defense and making it clear to Russia that if it chooses the path of renewed aggression, it will face massive consequences.
While the Quad has traditionally been focused on standing up to a rising and more aggressive China, there is still growing concern among the four countries that China and Russia are now presenting a united front. When asked about the Ukraine crisis, India's Foreign Minister S. Jaishankar said this. Listen in.
This meeting is focused on the Indo-Pacific, so I think you should figure out the geography there. And where we stand, our position on Ukraine, we have laid it out in public at the UN Security Council.
Meanwhile, the Prime Minister of Australia attended the Quad Foreign Ministers meeting in Melbourne. Scott Morrison said that the four countries were now facing a very fragile, fragmented and contested world, and that there is no more accentuated than here in the Indo-Pacific. But he was also reassured to be meeting with like-minded Quad partners.
We live in a very fragile, fragmented and contested world, and that is no more accentuated than here in our Indo-Pacific. And the like-minded partners that we see gathered together in this Quad, I always find so incredibly reassuring. I'm reassured by our perspective. I'm reassured by the understanding that is shared between each of us. I'm reassured by the incredible strong support that Australia has received by our Quad partners.
Our principal diplomatic correspondent Siddhant Sibbal gets us more details in this next report. Take a look.
Today was an important day in terms of geopolitics with the Quad Foreign Ministers meeting happening in Melbourne, Australia. Each and every word said and written, of course, at the joint statement was weighed and noted, of course, in capitals such as Beijing and in Moscow. But if you look at the key focus areas, concerns on Myanmar and North Korean missile tests, focus on cooperation, especially on COVID vaccines, and, of course, diplomatically, there was talk about increased aggressiveness by China. The joint statement talked about UNCLOS, that is UN laws of seas, which of course has been violated multiple times by Beijing. ASEAN centrality reiterated, but by and large what stood out was that when it comes to the joint statement, there was no mention on the crisis in Eastern Europe, the Russian build-up at the border with Ukraine. But the primary reason, of course, is that while Quad member countries have been together primarily amidst increased aggressiveness, when it comes to relationship with Russia, many countries, including, of course, India, has good relationship with Moscow, and including the pressers or all throughout the day we saw questionings by reporters in Melbourne regarding India and Russia. And the Indian External Affairs Minister clearly reiterated that when it comes to India's stance on Ukraine, on the crisis there in Eastern Europe, it has already been stated at the United Nations, and the talk all through the day will be on Indo-Pacific. So clearly India's good relationship with Russia are one of the key reasons that there was no mention of the crisis there in the joint statement. But nonetheless, today's meeting is important in terms of sending a message to global community that Quad is here to stay and grow. With video journalist Neeraj Patel, Sudhan Sibal for WION in New Delhi.
WION World is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news updates on the move.